Hello, my name's Suzanne Leal. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm going to read an excerpt from my book, The Deceptions. The excerpt is from the voice of Hannah, who's a Czech woman who is elderly now, but reminiscing over a life which has been difficult and eventful and also hopeful. In the excerpt I'm reading, Hannah has been sent to the Jewish ghetto outside Prague, Theresienstadt, where she's been staying with her parents. Her parents, though, have been called on a transport east, leaving Hannah behind. The day before their transport left, my mother took me aside. To hold me, yes. To tell me she loved me, yes. I was, after all, her only child, and all the motherly love she possessed had been sprinkled over me. So it was love she gave me when she pulled me aside, but not only that. There was something she needed to tell me. My mother was beautiful. I have said this already, and even when she was past her youth, her beauty did not leave her. It made people turn to look at her in the street. It made men fluster in front of her. Even as a child, I had seen this, and it made people whisper about her. Although I did not have my mother's beauty, I had inherited something of her appeal. As an adolescent, I too could turn heads in the street. I too could make men stare. From an early age, my mother had warned me about this. She had warned me to keep my distance, warned me to protect my modesty. This was something my parents also took care of for me. They monitored my associations and limited my social life to the children of parents they knew well. And although I carried myself with an air of confidence that may have appeared worldly, in truth, I had lived a sheltered life. So what my mother told me came as a shock. The way you are, she said, and the way you carry yourself means that you will never be short of attention. You will always attract interest, and you will always have admirers. Now is the time to use this. When I stayed silent, my mother's words became more urgent. These are ruthless times, Hannah, she said. This means that you too must be ruthless. It is the only way to survive. And that is your job now, to survive, to do whatever you need to keep yourself safe. We will not be there to protect you, so you must do what you can to protect yourself. Take protection wherever it is offered, and do what you must to secure it. Do what it takes to survive, my darling. Do whatever it takes. The child in me wanted to push her, wanted to challenge what she was telling me. Like what? I wanted to ask her, like what? But I knew what she meant. She was talking about that blue-eyed gendarme. She was talking about Karl Krutter. For I had shown her the gifts he had given me, the food, the soap, the cigarettes, and of course, the boots that had made bearable that ridiculous work I was forced to do. Be nice to him, my mother advised me, and if he pays you attention, show him some appreciation. I felt my eyes widen. What sort of appreciation, maminko? Whatever it takes, she had answered me, whatever it takes to keep you safe. Anything? I had whispered to her. Anything at all. That's a really big question. What I'm going to do to answer that is just break it up a little bit. I'm going to tell you a bit about the book itself, how the idea came for me or how it was given to me, and then consider what it means for someone like me who's not Jewish to be writing about the Holocaust. So The Deceptions is, as the title would imply, about a series of deceptions. It's about people who find themselves betraying or being betrayed, deceiving or being deceived. It's written in 4 voices. The main voice is a woman called Hannah, who when we meet her is in her late 80s and who has spent much of her life living in England, although she was born in Czechoslovakia as it then was. She's Jewish and she was part of the Holocaust, and it's her story of what happened there and what happened afterwards that forms the backbone of this novel. Interspersed in Hannah's voice, with Hannah's voice, are 3 other voices. The first is the voice of Tessa, who is a young 32-year-old Czech Australian woman who's having an affair with her boss. The next voice is that of Karl, her grandfather, who has made Australia his home, but for years earlier had been a gendarme, which was in Czechoslovakia. And a gendarme, as far as I understand it, is sort of halfway between a police officer and a military man. And he was a gendarme in one of the ghettos during the war called Theresienstadt, which I think many of you will know is outside Prague. The fourth voice in the book is Ruth Martin, who's a Uniting Church minister. She's in her 40s, she's single, and she's grappling with confidences given to her by her congregation and a life that she has made single and which is not always so easy. That's what the book's about. But essentially, I suppose for me, it's the book about a woman who has gone through the Holocaust and the repercussions of what she experienced down the line for her and also through the generations. It was a story that I feel was given to me, actually, and I'll just explain why. Years ago, when I'd come out of university, my then boyfriend and I moved to the beach in Sydney. So for those who aren't in Sydney, it's Tamarama, which is halfway between Bondi and Bronte. And as you know, I mean, it wasn't as expensive then as it is now, really expensive to rent. We found this ad where there was one catch. The landlords would be living right next door. And I thought, I can do that one. So we went to the inspection for the rental. I saw this bloke, quite an old bloke by that stage, and with one of those awful terry toweling tennis hats, you know, those ones that tennis stars used to wear but no longer do. And he was looking around, he was pretty curious, and I thought, I bet that's him, I bet that's the landlord. He was elderly, but he had clearly been blonde and he was very blue-eyed. And I thought, and I bet he's German. And I speak German. And so I went up to him, spoke to him in German, to his bemusement, as it turned out. But we got the place. Turns out Fred Perger was not German, but was a German speaker. He was Jewish and he was Czech, foremost Czech. He never really considered himself as Jewish until the war came along. And he was also a Holocaust survivor. We became very close, Fred and I also became very close to his wife, Eva. The interesting story is that Fred and Eva had met as teenagers and they had gone through the Holocaust together but separated. So they'd started in Theresienstadt and they'd moved on from there and were reunited finally at the end of the war. Fred, I just loved Fred. I mean, he's been dead for over 10 years now, but he's a bit like me. He's a little bit anxious. He's a bit anxious and he's a bit talkative. He worries a bit. He worried a bit about stuff. But unlike me, he had a photographic memory. And as we got to know each other, he would start to tell me very tentatively what had happened to him during his life, including what had happened during the war. Now, my experience of the war and Germany, in fact, was having been an art student at university and having done my honours degree in German, and part of it in Germany. I had very little knowledge of Judaism, of the Jewish situation, and even the Jewish Holocaust. So for this man who was this German speaker with whom I practiced this language I loved, to be telling me a story which was extraordinary, made me feel like I had something that no one else had. It made me think that I had got something new and I had ambitions to write. And Fred agreed that he would speak to me and that I could record the interview. And from there, my first novel, Border Street, arose. Although, of course, I wasn't the first to hear this, as I've very clearly found out. But I think during that time, the Czech experience was not often spoken about. Czechoslovakia had been under a communist regime for so long, so there was very little that had got out and very little that had been spoken about. And he was a man who had tried not to speak about this at all. He tried to be Australian and leave it all behind. So after some years, he trusted me and we every week would have an interview, and I'd transcribe his work. His story formed part of Border Street, the earlier book, but there was one story that he told me that years later just kept coming back to me. And I was running one day and the story kept coming back, and I thought, I think I'm just going to have to write it and be done with it. And this was the story, and these are the reasons I was reluctant to write it. So Fred and Eva had both been taken, and Fred, of course, in Prague was Bedrich rather than Fred. It's anglicised. Fred and Eva had been taken to Theresienstadt, and there they'd stayed. Eva's father was a surgeon, and he was quite well known in the camp. His name was Fischer, Dr. Franz Fischer, and he had helped one of the gendarmes. So the gendarmes were in charge of the camp. There were SS officers above them, and there was the Jewish Council of Elders who ran the day-to-day life, but there were also Czech gendarmes, and they were part police, part military, and they would oversee the working groups in the ghetto, for example. And he, one of these gendarmes had broken his arm, and Eva's father had set it for him. To say thank you, he'd offered to help, and by helping he would smuggle letters in from Prague and from the other barracks to them, and he would bring parcels in as well. The problem was this bloke, this gendarme, was married, and he was having what Fred called an affair or a relationship with one of the Jewish inmates. That was discovered, and as a result he was arrested. When he was arrested, his notebook was found. Eva's father's details were in it. That meant that Eva's father was no longer protected. He was taken to the small prison outside Theresienstadt, and Fred and Eva lost their protection. The gendarme returned home, but I never found out what happened to the woman with whom he'd had the relationship. I know more about that story than I'm going to tell you, because it will destroy the novel itself. But it's a story of quite some betrayal, and a story of such a deception that it took my breath away. And that's what I wanted to write out. I wanted to write out what was the relationship between this gendarme and this woman who was his prisoner? What were the power dynamics? How did it work? And what happened to her? I didn't have a name, I didn't know. And that's why I wrote the book. To come back to the question, I'm often asked about my particular responsibility in writing about the Holocaust and my particular interest, or in fact, right to tell a Holocaust story. I'm not Jewish, and what I've written in the book, I've had to learn, and I've had to question myself whether I am the right person to have written that story. And without any false modesty, I think I am. I think that I had the trust of a man who had this extraordinary story. I had the will to write, and I had the time that I could carve out to do it. Had I not been a neighbour, had I been a daughter, I wonder sometimes whether the story would have been too much for me, and whether I'm a lawyer in my day job, or at least part of my day job. And as a lawyer, you learn to become objective, you learn to pull back, you learn not to become too immersed. And I learned that to my detriment. No one wants a crying lawyer who's representing them in a difficult criminal case. So I already had the ability to be impartial. And I do think that while writing requires an emotional input, it also requires a distance. And I think I had trust, and I had the distance. And to be frank, I had the German as well. The story I was writing about is, I think, a story that hasn't often been written about. There's the relationship between the gendarmes and the inmates in Theresienstadt is one that hasn't had a lot written about it. There's a short story by a Czech writer during the war called Arnold Lustig, and there's an enormous book called Theresienstadt, which is by Adler. But apart from that, it's really not been an area that's been explored. And I had this story, and I had the ability to research it partly in German. In terms of responsibility, I think once I'd decided, yes, I could write it, I needed to make sure it was accurate. I think if you're going to do the Holocaust, you've got to do it in a way that could have taken place. One article I read said, you can write fiction, but if you're going to be writing fiction, put it in a place where it could have occurred. Use the exact transport numbers, use the exact distances, use the exact trip, don't make that up. So, and I'm not very good at geographically, but what I did when I was preparing the book, Hannah has a difficult trip. Hannah has a horrific trip. And the trip that she has is based upon the trip that Eva Perger took. So whilst she and Fred started off in Theresienstadt together, they were separated for part of the war. And part of her journey, if that's what you call it, was the death march. So what I did, and I've got the Steven Spielberg video that she gave him, or at least that she was involved in. So I would follow exactly what she did. So anywhere Hannah goes, Eva had gone there beforehand. And that gave me, I suppose, a confidence that what I was doing was accurate. There's also numerous, as you would know, memoirs that have been written by survivors of the Holocaust, and they were fundamental to me, because it's all very well to know the history, but what you need to know is the day-to-day stuff. You need to know what food there was. And Zdenka Fantlova's book, The Tin Ring, was very useful in particular for that. Finally, I had help. I sent the manuscript to Brown Presser and also to Leah Kaminsky, who are both very notable writers. And whilst I'm not ascribing any responsibility to them, they read the book for me, they read the manuscript for me, and they gave me the most extraordinary feedback. Feedback in terms of sensitivity, and particularly feedback as to what could have happened in the ghetto. Bram, as many of you will know, was an expert on Theresienstadt. And there was one particular piece of advice he gave me in terms of where Hannah and the gendarme could have met, which changed what I'd written, and I think sort of gives it an authority that it may have briefly lost. So look, I think the responsibility is to be accurate. I think it's to be sensitive. I also think it is to document, and I also think it is to be part of the preservation of oral histories where possible. And in transcribing the interviews I got from Fred, I was able to pass them on to his family, who have stayed friends with me. And look, I'm hoping that is a responsibility I've discharged as I wanted to. So yeah, Ruth, as I've said earlier, is a 43-year-old Uniting Church minister. She's single and she's had this calling to be a minister. To be honest, the reason I first put her into the book was that the book had, in my mind, been called The Wedding Party. And part of the book was to revolve around a wedding, and it was a church wedding, and the church wedding needed a minister, and Ruth was that minister. But that's a bit superficial. In terms of my interest, I've been involved in the Uniting Church for a while, in a sort of quite progressive part of it at Pitt Street Uniting Church. And in that capacity, I've seen a number of ministers who have been less traditional. So, and less traditional includes a woman minister. And it occurred to me sort of over the years, and having spoken to people, that yeah, the traditional minister is a male minister who comes with a wife. So you get paid not very much, and you get two for the price of one. You get the bloke that does the sermons, and you get the woman who does the Sunday school, or who does a lot of the pastoral care. And then, to the credit of the church, women were able to become ministers. But in my experience, what the female ministers have been quite different. Often they haven't been married, or often they haven't come as a couple, they've come single. And often they've started young, so the vocation has started young, which, and in the case of Ruth, is not the most exciting place to be if you're trying to date. So to say that you're a minister and a female minister, in my experience, it seems that it can be very difficult to find a partner if that's what you want. And the pastoral care component of that job is so great that a whole lot of your energy is taken for that. And you get a whole lot of secrets. I mean, as a minister, you get secrets given to you, you get confidences, and you get trust placed in you. And if you're a male minister, I imagine that it's, I'm not saying this from the Uniting Church's perspective, but I imagine it's almost expected that you may share some of those confidences with your partner. What happens if you have no partner? What happens if you're single and you're getting to a stage where having children may not be an option and you're in this enormous job? So I suppose part of it was to try to explore that work and the work of secret keeper, but who looks after the person who guards the secrets. The second part of Ruth's life is that she's second generation minister. So her father was also a minister. His name's Harry Martin, and he's now elderly. He's got Parkinson's and he's starting to have dementia. Look, quite frankly, that was a tribute to my father. My father wasn't a minister, but he was an academic, a French academic, and I've always loved languages, French and German. And to watch such a giant in terms of intellect sink into what turned out to be a pretty difficult disease with Parkinson's, and then to watch his mind further deteriorate was painful. But I also wanted in my novel to show that it's not the end of a life, and that a person in such situation has value. And in fact, in the Deceptions is almost pivotal to one of the resolutions of the book. And like I must say, while my dad was around, he went in Sydney to the Burgess Centre, which is like a centre for people who have got some cognitive issues, elderly, and it was fantastic. His dignity was restored, his sense of cultural interest was restored, and I suppose this was an area that I wanted to explore through Ruth because of her closeness to him and to her father at least, and what happens when the baton is passed. So what happens when the patriarch or the matriarch is deteriorating, and the baton needs to be passed to that younger person, and she's the one who has to take the responsibility. So a third thing with Ruth was there's an interesting relationship that develops between her father's carer Amir and Ruth, and in that I wanted to examine the power dynamics with that, even for someone as tolerant as Ruth, and the value that Amir adds to this story. So Hannah is the Czech woman who we meet in her later life, and Tessa is the granddaughter of Karel Kruter, who was the gendarme in Theresienstadt. Now Tessa's having an affair with her boss, and Hannah has been involved in what has turned out to be quite a betrayal. I won't say too much more about that. For both these characters, I wanted to look at power dynamics. I wanted to look at who has the power. And I don't think it's always as easy as you might expect. So Karl Kruter is the prison guard, effectively, and Hannah is his ward, or at least the prisoner he's in charge of. And that would seem to be very clear. The power dynamic is very, very clear with him. And of course, in reality, it is. The problem is that there's more to it than that Hannah is a very educated, intellectual character who's beguiling to Karl. And this makes the relationship less easy to understand than you might expect. So that was an interesting dynamic I wanted to explore. Similarly with Tessa, I wanted to explore what happens when a woman finds herself involved with a boss. And he's not a great bloke, this Evan. He was fun to write, but he's not great. How does she get herself into this situation, and what sort of steps can she take, or should she take, to get herself out? I've always been interested in that role of what used to be called the mistress, I suppose, in the responsibility of the mistress. I mean, she's the one in this case who's single. Is it a disloyalty to other women for her having an affair with a married man, or is that purely his problem and the problem within his marriage? And I don't think it's as easy a question to answer, and that was one of the questions I wanted to explore. Me Too, of course, has been a revolution, an absolute revolution for women, and I think it has been about looking for safety and confidence. I didn't consciously look to weave Me Too into this book, but it must well be that this whole movement has been bubbling for so long that it can't help but pierce part of your ideas and your narrative. So if anything, I think what Me Too did was to focus on the need for confidence and safety amongst women, and perhaps, yes, confidence and safety was one of the things that explains the changes wrought in Tessa and Hannah. Yeah, look, I think exactly that. It's a positive and almost calming influence amongst the horror. I think one of the difficulties in writing about the Holocaust is that you can be so mired in the horror that it becomes unrelenting and so unable to read. And I didn't want a book that was so unrelenting that there was no relief, because I wanted to keep my readers with me, and I wanted to talk about resilience, and I wanted to talk about hope. And I think, I hope I'm not being too fanciful, but I think there were both of these things that were shown in the Holocaust. And for me, Eliska is the best friend of Hannah. She's a woman who Hannah meets in Auschwitz, and who follows Hannah through the rest of that journey. She is small, she is softly spoken, and she is good. And I think there are people who display goodness, and I think there are people who display bravery and goodness and hope when all around them things are falling apart. I don't know that I'm that sort of person, so I'm particularly interested in someone who is, and I have in my life met those people. I think Eliska is also in part a homage to Fred and his friendship with a man called Honza, so I never met. So Honza was one of the boys that Fred had known through Prague, who found himself on a transport to Auschwitz with Fred. And Fred, who was a bit of a he-man really, in a very cultured sort of way, told me almost with embarrassment how he and Honza would hold hands during this train to get them through. And it was fundamental to Fred having Honza there. And even though I'd never met him, I always felt very fondly towards him. It was also a homage to Eva and her mother and her sister. So when Eva was taken, this is Eva Perger rather than the character Hannah, when Eva Perger was taken also to Auschwitz. She went not with Fred, but with her mother and her sister. And they were very close. And the way in which Eva speaks about her mother and her sister made me visualize the comfort that they must have given each other during times that were, well, I mean, unbelievable. I mean, completely unbelievable. And so perhaps Eliska really becomes the woman that embodies all of that. She's also a midwife, and I was interested in midwives because midwives have had a really, really interesting history, from being completely responsible to birth, for birth, the birth process, to being excluded from it. So I wanted to look at, in the midst of death, there was this woman who was a bringer of life, and for me that was the juxtaposition with Eliska. Yes, yes, I think I have been able to leave the stories and characters behind in themselves. I'm a lawyer by training. I think it was a training that was sort of hard come by. I don't think I'm a natural lawyer, but I've been schooled into one. And one of the things that you're taught is that you deal with a case, you finish the case, and you're moving on to the next case. At the moment, I'm on a tribunal called the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal, like the VCAT, and the New South Wales one, and that's what we do. I mean, you do a case. It can be a very difficult case. I do a lot of working with children, check clearances. You finish it. You do what you can to have made the right decision, and then you move on. And if you haven't made the right decision, you hope that at the next stage in the process, before the Supreme Court, that's remedied. But I think it's something that I've been taught to do to keep you sane, because otherwise you just keep on second guessing everything you've done. And I suspect that's also flown into, it's also traveled into my writing. So with my writing, I don't know, for all those writers out there, it's like this, process. So it's, for me at least, it's, you start and it's really awful because you've got to write a first draft, and that's really awful, and you don't want to do it because it's too much work, and you can't do it anyway because you're not good enough. And then you get to the end of the draft and you think, okay, that's great. And then you read it again, you think, no, it's not. And then you start again. And then I find that when I'm getting towards completion, it's like a gallop. It's a gallop that you just can't, you know, anything else in your way is a hindrance, and you just want to finish and finish and finish, like a race. And I swear, once the race is finished, you don't want to go back and do it again. You just want to have it finished. Having said that, I think that what I do is return to the same themes. I think someone said, many people have said, that a writer only writes about one thing or one or two things. I think what I'm interested in at the moment is truth and deception, truth and secrets, what the nature of the truth is. I think being a lawyer, we're encouraged to make decisions to find out what happened. But is that the truth? I mean, whose truth are you taking? How much weight do you give a certain person's truth? So I think in all the books I write, that's been an interesting thing. The book previous to The Deceptions was called The Teacher's Secret. And that's about, it's set in a small coastal community, and the plot centres on a primary school teacher who's forced into early retirement following allegations made against him. And that was interesting for me because of the nature of where is the truth, and what do you do with it once you find it? And I think in the book I'm writing now, that's a thesis that I'll continue. In terms of the deceptions, though, I think I've been very lucky. I think I was very lucky to have met people like Fred and Eva Perger and their family. I think I've been very lucky to have been included in a family that wasn't mine, with a story that wasn't mine. And so even if the particular story itself I can leave behind, what I feel grateful for is that I've been included in such a family, and which has given such a broadening for my life.